The silence came without warning. One day, prayer felt alive, full rich with the sense that someone was listening, responding, present in ways you could almost touch. And then, without explanation, without any apparent cause, the presence vanished. The words you spoke in prayer seemed to dissolve into emptiness. The comfort you once felt evaporated. The certainty that God was near became a distant memory, replaced by something far more unsettling. The overwhelming sense that you are praying into a void. If you have experienced this, you know it is not a minor inconvenience. It is not simply the absence of emotional consolation. It is the terrifying suspicion that God himself has withdrawn, that you have done something wrong, that you have been abandoned, that the relationship you thought was real was perhaps never there at all. And the questions come flooding in. Did I sin? Did I fail? Did I somehow drive God away? What do I do when prayer becomes an exercise in speaking to silence? How do I continue when every attempt to connect with God feels like pushing against a wall that will not move? This experience is so common, so universal among those who take prayer seriously that it has a name. St. John of the Cross called it the dark night, not the dark night as poetic metaphor, not darkness as a temporary mood, but darkness as a specific, intentional, profoundly purposeful work of God in the soul, a work so important that without it, you will never reach the depth of union with Him that your heart was created for. Most people, when they encounter this silence, make one of two catastrophic mistakes. They either conclude that something is wrong with them and redouble their efforts to fix whatever they imagine they broke, or they conclude that God is distant, uncaring, perhaps not even real, and they walk away from prayer entirely. But St. John of the Cross understood something that changes everything about how you experience God's silence. When God goes silent, He is not absent. He is working, not working somewhere else while ignoring you, working specifically, intentionally, personally in you. And what He is doing in that silence is something He cannot do when you feel His presence, something essential, something that will transform not just your prayer, but your entire relationship with Him. Let me say that clearly. God's silence is not a punishment. It is not abandonment. It is not evidence of His absence. It is evidence of His presence in a mode you have not yet learned to recognize. It is the sign that He is doing something deeper than comfort, something more important than reassurance, something that requires the removal of every lesser support so that you learn to stand on Him alone. This is what St. John of the Cross spent his life explaining. This is what his writings, dense, mystical, often misunderstood, are actually about. What happens in the silence? What God is doing when every sensation of His presence disappears? Why the darkness is not the end of the spiritual journey, but the necessary passage to its deepest fulfillment. And if you understand this, if you can grasp what is actually happening when God goes silent, it will not make the silence comfortable, but it will make it bearable. It will give you the courage to stay when every instinct tells you to leave. It will allow you to trust that the emptiness you feel is not abandonment, but love, working in a way that feels like its opposite. Because here is the truth St. John discovered through years of his own excruciating silence. God withdraws the feeling of His presence precisely because He wants to give you something better than feelings. He hides precisely because He wants to reveal Himself more fully than He could, while you were depending on consolations. He goes silent precisely because He wants to teach you a language of communion that does not require words, emotions, or any of the sensory supports you have been using to know that He is near. This is not theory. This is not mystical speculation designed for monks and contemplatives who have nothing better to do than analyze their interior states. This is practical wisdom for anyone who has ever prayed and then stopped feeling anything, for anyone who has ever wondered if they are doing something wrong because prayer no longer works the way it used to, for anyone who has ever stood in the silence and asked the question that terrifies every honest soul, where did you go? The answer St. John gives is both simple and profound: nowhere. God did not go anywhere. You are simply being trained to find Him somewhere other than in the feelings you have been using to confirm His presence. You are being weaned from spiritual consolations so you can receive something far better: God Himself, not as an experience you have, but as a reality you rest in regardless of what you feel. But to understand this fully, to grasp what God is actually doing in the silence, you must first understand what you have been doing before the silence came. Because the silence is not random. It is a response, a purposeful intervention designed to address something in your spiritual life that needed addressing, something you probably did not even know was there. When you first began to pray seriously, when you first tasted what it means to encounter God in a way that feels real and personal and alive, something happened that you did not notice. You began to confuse God with the experience of God. You began to love the consolation more than the consoler. You began to seek prayer not primarily for Him, but for what prayer gave you: peace, clarity, warmth, the reassurance that you were on the right path. This is not malicious. It is completely natural. Human beings are sensory creatures. We know things through what we feel, what we experience, what registers in our awareness as real. So when God gives consolation in prayer, and He does generously, especially at the beginning of the spiritual life, we naturally attach to that consolation. We begin to measure the quality of our prayer by how it feels. We assume that when we feel close to God, we are close to God, and when we feel nothing, we have drifted away. But this assumption, natural as it is, creates a problem. Because as long as you depend on feelings to know God is present, your relationship with Him remains fundamentally immature. It is a relationship built on what you receive rather than on who He is. It is a relationship that will collapse the moment the feelings stop, which they inevitably will, because feelings by their nature fluctuate, change, come and go based on factors that have nothing to do with God's actual presence or absence. And God knows this. He knows that if He allows you to remain dependent on consolations, you will never grow beyond a certain point. You will always be a child in the spiritual life, needing constant reassurance, constant emotional confirmation that He is there. You will never develop the mature faith that can stand in darkness, the deep trust that does not require proof, the love that gives itself freely without needing to feel anything in return. So He withdraws the consolations, not to punish you, not to test whether you will stay faithful out of fear or obligation, but to invite you into something deeper, to create the conditions in which mature faith can actually develop, to remove every lesser support so you learn to lean on Him alone, not on the experience of Him, not on the feelings He gives, not on the consolations that make prayer feel worthwhile, but on Him, just Him, His bare, unadorned, uncomplicated reality as the God who loves you whether you feel it or not. This is what happens when God goes silent. He is not leaving, He is teaching you to relate to Him in a way that does not depend on what you feel, teaching you to trust Him when trust requires actual faith rather than emotional certainty, teaching you to love Him for who He is rather than for what He gives you. But here is where most people make their first crucial mistake. They interpret the silence as a problem to solve. They assume that if prayer has become dry, difficult, empty of feeling, then they must be doing something wrong. So they try to fix it. They pray harder, longer, with more discipline. They examine their conscience for hidden sins that might be blocking God's presence. They read books on prayer methods, try new techniques, experiment with different approaches, all in an attempt to restore the feelings they have lost. And none of it works. Because the problem is not that you are praying incorrectly. The problem is that you are still trying to pray the old way, when God is inviting you to pray a new way. You are still seeking consolation when God is trying to teach you to seek Him. You are still measuring prayer by how it feels when God is training you to measure it by fidelity regardless of feeling. St. John of the Cross saw this pattern constantly. People would come to him in spiritual crisis, convinced that they had lost their way, that they were regressing spiritually, that they were doing something terribly wrong because prayer no longer gave them what it used to give. And he would tell them something that shocked them. You are not regressing. You are progressing. The emptiness you feel is not a sign of failure, but a sign of growth. God has not withdrawn because you did something wrong. He has withdrawn because He is doing something right, something necessary for your spiritual maturation. But He would also warn them, if you try to go back, if you resist this darkness and attempt to restore the old consolations through effort or technique, you will actually block what God is trying to do. Because what God is doing requires your cooperation in a very specific way. Not the cooperation of effort, but the cooperation of surrender. Not trying harder, but letting go. Not fixing the problem, but accepting that what feels like a problem is actually the solution to a deeper problem you did not know you had. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of what St. John teaches, that the appropriate response to God's silence is not more activity but more stillness, not more striving but more trust, not filling the silence with desperate attempts to make prayer work again, but learning to simply be in the silence, allowing it to do its work without interference, because the silence itself is the work, the darkness itself is the purification, the absence of feeling is the very thing stripping away your dependence on feelings, so that something truer, something deeper, something more stable can emerge in their place. Think of it this way. When a parent is teaching a child to walk, there comes a moment when the parent must let go. The child, who has been depending on the parent's hand for support, suddenly feels that support withdrawn, and in that moment, the child faces a choice: panic and fall, or trust that the parent is still there even though the hand is gone, and take the step forward into unsupported walking. The silence of God is that moment. The withdrawal of felt presence is the letting go of the hand, and you are being invited not to panic, not to fall back into dependence on what you can feel, but to take the step forward into faith that does not require the support of sensory confirmation, to walk spiritually on your own legs, not truly on your own because God is more present than ever, but without the training wheels of emotional consolation that you have been using to know He is there. This is terrifying. Make no mistake, St. John does not minimize how difficult this is. He describes the dark night in language that makes it clear he knew this terror personally. The sense of abandonment, the fear that you have lost God forever, the temptation to believe that the darkness means you were never really loved at all. But he also insists with absolute certainty that this terror is temporary and the transformation it produces is eternal. That if you can endure the silence without running from it, without trying to fix it, without concluding that it means something is wrong, if you can simply remain faithful in the darkness, trusting that God is doing something you cannot see, you will emerge on the other side with a faith that cannot be shaken, a love that does not fluctuate with feelings, a relationship with God that is finally built on reality rather than experience. And this is what God is doing when He goes silent. He is building that foundation. He is removing everything that is not Him so that you can finally rest on Him alone. He is stripping away the consolations so that you stop loving the gifts and start loving the giver. He is hiding so that you stop seeking the experience of His presence and start seeking His will, His glory, His reality, independent of what it does for you. This is hard to accept when you are in the middle of it. When prayer has become a desert, when every attempt to connect with God feels like failure, when you would give anything just to feel again what you once felt so easily and now cannot find no matter how hard you try. But St. John would tell you, stop trying. Not stop praying, never stop praying, but stop trying to make prayer feel like something. Stop trying to generate the consolations that God has deliberately removed. Stop measuring your spiritual life by emotional metrics that God is purposefully teaching you to transcend. Instead, do this. Show up. Every day, in the silence, in the darkness, in the emptiness. Not with the expectation that today will be different, that today you will finally feel something again, but with simple fidelity, with the decision to be present to God whether you feel Him or not, with trust that He is doing something in the silence that He could not do in the noise. And slowly, so slowly you will not notice it happening, something will shift. Not a return to the old consolations. Those are gone, and trying to get them back is trying to go backward, but something new, something deeper, a kind of peace that does not depend on feeling peaceful, a kind of certainty that does not require emotional confirmation, a kind of communion with God that exists beneath the surface of consciousness, in a place where feelings do not reach, but where reality is more solid than anything feelings could ever provide. This is what St. John called union. Not union as mystical experience, though that may come, but union as the alignment of your will with God's will so complete that you are at rest in Him regardless of what you feel. Union as the state where you love him, not for what he gives you, but for who he is. Union as the relationship that remains constant, whether you feel close or distant, warm or cold, consoled or desolate. And you cannot reach this union by any path except through the darkness, because the darkness is what strips away everything that is not union. The silence is what reveals that union does not depend on words. The absence of feeling is what proves that love is deeper than emotion. This is what God does when he goes silent. He loves you in a way that feels like its opposite. He draws you closer by seeming to push you away. He gives you more of himself by taking away the experiences you were using as substitutes for him. And if you can trust this, if you can believe that the silence is not abandonment, but invitation, not punishment, but purification, not the end of your relationship with God, but its necessary transformation into something that can finally bear the weight of eternity, then the darkness stops being something to escape and becomes something to enter. Not with eagerness, perhaps, but with trust, with the faith that what you cannot see is more real than what you once felt, with the love that continues giving itself even when it receives nothing in return except the bare knowledge that God is worthy of that gift. There is a specific moment in the dark night that determines whether you will emerge transformed or whether you will spend years circling back to where you started, never quite grasping what God was trying to accomplish. It is the moment when you must decide what to do with the silence. Most people, when they reach this moment, do one of three things. They try to escape it by filling their lives with spiritual activity, more services attended, more Bible studies joined, more religious books read, anything to create the sensation that they are still connected to God, even though prayer itself has become empty. Or they conclude that they have somehow failed spiritually and sink into self-condemnation, reviewing their lives for the sin that must have caused this abandonment. Or they simply walk away, assuming that if God has gone silent, the relationship is over, and there is no point in continuing to pray into emptiness. All three responses make the same fundamental mistake. They assume the silence means something is wrong, that it is a problem requiring a solution, that the goal is to escape the darkness and return to the light as quickly as possible. But St. John of the Cross would tell you that the silence is not something to escape, it is something to enter, not with resignation, not with gritted teeth, but with trust that this darkness is doing something for you that the light could not do, that God has specific reasons for withdrawing the sense of his presence, and those reasons are merciful even when they feel cruel. What are those reasons? Why would a loving God deliberately hide from the soul that is seeking him? St. John identifies several, and understanding them changes everything about how you experience the silence. First, God withdraws felt presence to purify your motives for seeking him. As long as prayer gives you consolation, there is always a subtle question lurking beneath your devotion. Are you seeking God, or are you seeking the good feelings that come from seeking God? Are you praying because you love him, or because prayer makes you feel peaceful, centered, spiritually accomplished? The question is not always easy to answer, because the two desires, love of God and love of what God gives, often run together so closely that you cannot distinguish between them. But God can distinguish, and he knows that as long as you are seeking him partly for the consolations, your love remains mixed, impure, divided between wanting him and wanting what he provides. So he removes the consolations to reveal what is actually motivating you, and in that revelation, often painful, often humbling, you discover that you were more attached to the gifts than you realized, that you loved the feelings of prayer more than you loved the God to whom you were praying. This discovery is not meant to condemn you. It is meant to free you, because once you see the attachment, once you recognize how much of your spiritual life has been built on seeking experiences rather than seeking God, you can finally begin to release it. You can finally begin to pray not because it makes you feel good, but simply because God is worthy of prayer. Not because it gives you peace, but because giving him your attention is the right response to who he is. And this shift, from seeking God for what he gives to seeking God for who he is the difference between spiritual infancy and spiritual maturity. It is the difference between a relationship based on what you get and a relationship based on love that gives without counting the cost. Second, God withdraws to teach you that his presence is not dependent on your ability to feel it. This sounds obvious when stated as doctrine. Of course, God is present, even when you do not feel him. Of course, his love does not fluctuate with your emotions. Every Christian would affirm this intellectually, but living it is different. Because as long as you have felt God's presence regularly in prayer, you have not truly tested whether your faith can stand without that feeling. You have not discovered whether you can trust that he is present when every sensory indicator suggests he is absent. You have not learned to walk by faith rather than by sight, to use Paul's language, because sight in the form of felt presence has always been available. The silence forces the test. It removes the felt presence and asks, can you still believe? Can you still trust? Can you still pray, still worship, still orient your life toward a God you cannot feel, cannot sense, cannot detect through any of the ordinary means by which you know something is real? This is not an academic question. It is the question that determines whether your faith is built on rock or sand, whether your relationship with God can survive the inevitable seasons when he seems absent, whether your love is strong enough to continue giving when it receives no emotional return. And the silence is where you discover the answer, not through introspection or self-analysis, but through the simple act of continuing or not continuing to pray when prayer gives you nothing. Through the decision to remain faithful or not remain faithful when faithfulness no longer feels rewarding. Third, God withdraws to create space for a deeper kind of communion than feelings can provide. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect to understand because it involves something you have not yet experienced. As long as your primary mode of connecting with God is through emotional consolation, you are limited to the kind of relationship emotions can sustain, and emotions by their nature are unstable, fluctuating, dependent on countless factors both physical and psychological that have nothing to do with God's actual presence. But there is another mode of communion. St. John calls it spiritual, as opposed to sensory. It is a communion that happens in the depths of the soul, beneath the level of consciousness, in a place where you cannot feel it happening, but where it is more real and more transformative than anything you could feel. This communion does not register as experience. It does not give you warm feelings or clear insights or dramatic confirmations that God is present. It is simply the quiet, hidden, utterly real encounter between your soul and God. An encounter that is doing more to unite you to him than years of consoling prayer ever could, but that you cannot detect through any of the normal means by which you measure spiritual progress. The silence creates space for this deeper communion by removing the shallower consolations that would distract you from it. It strips away the emotional layer so that the spiritual layer can do its work undisturbed. It hides the surface so you can finally discover the depths. But this means that while you are in the silence, you will not feel like anything is happening. You will not sense growth or progress or movement. You will simply feel empty, dry, abandoned. And you will be tempted to conclude that nothing is happening, that you are wasting your time, that prayer has become pointless. This is the test. Can you trust that something real is happening, even when you cannot feel it? Can you believe that God is doing his deepest work precisely when you sense nothing at all? Can you remain faithful to prayer, not because it gives you anything you can detect, but simply because faithfulness is what love does regardless of what it receives? Fourth, God withdraws to teach you the difference between his presence and your awareness of his presence. This distinction is crucial, but easily missed. God's presence is constant, unchanging, utterly reliable. He is always with you, always sustaining you, always holding you in existence by the sheer force of his will. His presence does not come and go based on how you feel or what you are experiencing, but your awareness of his presence does fluctuate. Sometimes you feel him near, sometimes you do not. Sometimes prayer is full of consolation, sometimes it is empty, sometimes his voice seems clear, sometimes you hear nothing. The mistake most people make is assuming that when their awareness of God's presence disappears, God's actual presence has disappeared. That when they cannot feel him, he is not there. That when prayer becomes dry, he has withdrawn. But St. John insists, God has not withdrawn. Your awareness has changed. And God has allowed your awareness to change specifically to teach you that His presence is not dependent on your ability to perceive it, that He is closer to you in the silence than He ever was in the consolations, that the emptiness you feel is not His absence, but the stripping away of the sensory props you were using to convince yourself He was present. Once you grasp this, once you truly understand that God's presence is constant regardless of what you feel, the silence loses its terror, not its difficulty, not its darkness, but its power to make you doubt whether God is real, whether He loves you, whether the relationship you thought you had was genuine. Because the relationship is genuine, God is present. His love has not changed. What has changed is your mode of perceiving it. And that change, though painful, is necessary for your growth into the kind of faith that can sustain you, not just in the easy seasons, but in the hard ones. Not just when everything makes sense, but when nothing does. Not just when you feel close to God, but when you feel utterly alone. This is what God is doing when He goes silent, teaching you to live by faith rather than feeling, to trust His presence even when you cannot sense it, to love Him when love costs you everything you were using to confirm that the love was mutual. And the beauty of this teaching, the gift hidden within the darkness, is that once you learn it, once you discover through lived experience that God is present in the silence, that His love is real when you feel nothing, that prayer still connects you to Him, even when it gives you no consolation, you become unshakable, not immune to future struggles, not beyond the reach of doubt, but anchored in a faith that has been tested in the darkness and found solid. This is the faith that survives loss, the faith that endures suffering, the faith that can look at death itself and not despair because it has already learned, in the smaller death of God's silence, that absence of feeling is not absence of reality, that what you cannot see is more reliable than what you can, that the God who seemed to hide was actually closer than breathing, working in depths you could not perceive to bring about a transformation you could not have imagined. St. John of the Cross did not write about the dark night as theory. He lived it, for years. In circumstances that would break most people, imprisoned by his own religious brothers, beaten, isolated, left to wonder whether God had abandoned him entirely. And in that darkness, he discovered what he spent the rest of his life trying to communicate, that the darkness is not the end. It is the beginning of something so beautiful, so profound, so utterly transformative, that no consolation could compare to it. What he discovered was this, that when God strips away every sensation of His presence, when He removes every consolation you were using to know He was near, when He allows you to walk in such complete darkness that you can neither see the path ahead nor remember the path behind, He is giving you a gift that only emptiness can receive. That gift is Himself, not an experience of Him, not a feeling about Him, not a theological understanding or mystical vision or dramatic encounter, just Him, pure, unmediated, unadorned by anything that would allow you to possess Him or control Him or reduce Him to something manageable by your mind or predictable by your expectations. In the darkness, God comes to you as He actually is, infinite, incomprehensible, utterly beyond anything your faculties can grasp or your emotions can register. And paradoxically, this darkness, this complete inability to sense or feel or know Him through any normal means, is actually a deeper form of union than any consolation could provide. Because in the darkness, there is nothing between you and Him, no feelings to mediate the relationship, no experiences to interpret, no consolations to cling to. Just bare soul meeting infinite God in a silence so complete that it is itself a form of communion more intimate than words. This is what St. John meant by transforming union. Not union as something you feel, but union as something you are. The state in which your will has become so aligned with God's will that there is no longer any conflict, any resistance, any part of you pulling away from Him. The state in which you love what He loves, want what He wants, choose what He chooses, not because you have lost yourself, but because you have finally found yourself in Him. And you cannot reach this union except through darkness, because the darkness is what strips away everything that is not God, everything that is not love, everything that is not the deepest truth of who you are before Him. The darkness purifies motives. It burns away attachments. It reveals and removes every subtle form of self-seeking that masquerades as devotion. But here is what St. John also knew. Most people never complete the journey through darkness, not because they lack the capacity, not because God abandons them in the night, but because they give up too soon. They interpret the darkness as failure and turn back toward the light they knew before, never discovering the greater light that waits on the other side. Or they try to rush through the darkness, impatient with the slowness of the process, wanting transformation now, unwilling to endure the years, sometimes decades, that it takes for God to accomplish what He is doing in the silent depths. Or they fill the darkness with activity, with theological study or spiritual practices or religious busyness, anything to avoid simply being still and letting the darkness do its work. All of these responses are understandable, natural, human. But all of them block what God is trying to accomplish, because what God is trying to accomplish requires something that goes against every human instinct. The willingness to remain in darkness without understanding why, to continue in silence without knowing when it will end, to trust that God is doing something good, even when everything feels bad. This is the cross of the dark night, not the cross of dramatic suffering or visible persecution, but the hidden cross of interior abandonment, the cross of continuing to love when love receives no confirmation that it is mutual, the cross of faith that cannot see, hope that has no evidence, love that gets nothing in return. And the question is not whether you will experience this cross. If you pursue God seriously, you will. The question is what you will do when you find it. Will you carry it, or will you put it down and search for an easier way? St. John would tell you there is no easier way, not to the depths, not to the union that your soul was made for, not to the love that is pure gift rather than exchange. You can have pleasant spiritual experiences without the dark night. You can have consoling prayer and feelings of closeness and moments of joy in God's presence. But you cannot have transformation. You cannot have the death of the false self and the birth of the true self. You cannot have the freedom that comes from wanting nothing except God, and the peace that comes from needing nothing except His will. Those things, transformation, freedom, peace, are found only on the other side of darkness. And the only way to the other side is through. So what do you do when God goes silent? You stay. You pray, even when prayer gives you nothing. You show up in the darkness day after day without demanding that today be different. You trust that God is doing something too deep for you to feel, too important to be rushed, too transformative to happen in any way except slowly, hidden in the dark. You stop trying to fix the silence. You stop trying to earn back the consolations. You stop measuring your spiritual life by emotional metrics that God has deliberately rendered meaningless for this season. Instead, you accept the darkness as gift, painful gift, confusing gift, gift that feels like punishment and absence and failure, but gift nonetheless. The gift of being stripped of everything that is not God so that you can finally receive God Himself. This is what God does when He goes silent. He loves you in the only way that can make you ready for the fullness of union He has always wanted to give you. He hides, so you will seek Him where He actually is, instead of where you imagine Him to be. He withdraws the experience of His presence, so you will discover His presence is deeper than any experience could reach. And if you can trust this, if you can endure the silence without running, without despairing, without concluding that the darkness means you are lost, you will emerge on the other side knowing something that no amount of consolation could ever teach you, that God is faithful even when you feel abandoned, present even when you sense nothing, working even when everything seems still, loving you with a love that does not depend on your ability to feel it. That knowledge, tested and proven in the furnace of darkness, is worth more than every consolation you ever lost. It is the foundation of mature faith, the anchor of unshakable hope, the substance of love that can finally give itself completely because it has learned it is not giving to get anything in return. This is the gift God gives in silence, and it is a gift you can only receive by accepting the silence itself as the way He has chosen to give it.